So this is the code for my more finite state machine, and the way I wrote the code is I taken a transition table by asking for the number of states that there are and the number of inputs there are. And I want to know the number of states because I want to create a list that contains all the states based on position. So position 0 indicates state 0, and position 1 indicates state 1, and so on and so on. And then I wanted a number of inputs because the inputs are used as basically, I guess you would say, an index uh, for multiple of my loops. And so first we take in the states, how many states there are in a Mooremachine, then we take in the inputs, and then I have an empty list that has the inputs, and then based on the number of inputs, I ask the user over and over again, so what's one input, what's another input, what's another input, based on how many told me they were. Then I create an empty state list with which is the size of how many inputs there are. Yeah, so I paused the video because I realized that this should be number of states and not number of inputs. So yeah, so the state list is equal, or the size of the state list will just be how many states there are. And then I go in here in this for loop, and then I create a class for each state possible in the list. So each list position contains a class called state. And in state, we have our initializing function, which just takes in the object and the number of inputs that there are, the state number, meaning, all right, so what state is this object? And then I set an output to nothing. So then I just set the number of inputs to num inputs because I need the class to know how many inputs there are. This transitions list will contain the transition for each input, and I'll explain that more later. And then we have state number, and then the output, which is set to nothing. So first, we figure out what, since this is a Mooremachine and each state has its own specific output, we need to find out what's the output. So in here, the first function is actually to find out the output. So I ask the user, what's the output for the state? And that's why you have state number, so that you know the current state. So if we're at, let's say, the first state, which would actually technically be the second state, it could be S1, then we would fill in whatever user puts. And then we call the state transition function, which takes itself and the inputs list, and this shouldn't be here. And so we run a function based on the size of, or how many transitions there are, and the number of transitions are equal to the number of states. I'm sorry, no. The number of transitions are based on how many inputs there are. So for each possible input, there's a different possible, or they could be the same, but there's a possible transition. So the way this transition list works, so whatever value is in, like let's say input 0, then that input value, which is in there, will correlate to the value in the transitions list. So for this to make more sense, let me show this out. Can I zoom out of here? Anyway, so I'll tell the user, hey, so when we're in state whatever, and we're given the input, and the input is found through the inputs list, which was given by the user. And so we're cycling through that in this for loop. So when we're given this input, what transition do we go to? And then whatever they tell us, we set that value to that that transition or that state value to this. So like let's say whatever in the fourth position of the input list, that will be in the fourth position of the transitions list, or whatever it's in the fifth position of the input list, it will be in the fifth position of the transitions list. So they correlate in position. So that's how I keep track of what state to go to from a specific state based on the input. And then, so after we fill out basically the whole table, which is the majority of the function, then we ask the user for the input string, and then we have this output variable, which we'll print out later, and we have to make it empty so we can append to it. And then I have a current state variable that starts at 0 because you know you're going to start at S0. So in this for loop, I take the range to the number of inputs plus 1, just because the more function or the Mooremachine has one more, the output string is one more than the input string. And then I set the output immediately to the first output value of S0. And then I go in a for loop and I look at the first position in the string, and I say, okay, based on what the user gave me, where is this value in the input list? And when I find that value, I find the correlating value in the current state's transitions list. And then I set that next state that we're supposed to go to the current state value. And then I end the for loop. And then we go back out here, and then we add to the string again whatever the output is for the new state. And I feel like that should work perfectly, but when I run it, I'll enter all the inputs, and then I get this error here: list indices must be integers or slices, and I get the same exact error in the melee code. So I'll probably come to you, Dr. Salon, and see what I'm not getting about Python. But other than that, everything should work. But yeah, thank you.